folks. Welcome to the next edition of Serverless Craic. How are we getting on?
Hello.
Welcome back, Mr. Michael O'Reilly, with what the hell's that background?
All good. I'm embracing AI and generating all sorts of images these days. I'm unstoppable.
I
Great.
hope
Congrats.
that's
Yeah, there
licensed.
you go.
Hope that's
Serverless Craic.
licensed. Is that licensed from IT Revolution?
Not sure.
It's
Probably not.
very space age.
I like it. It's
Very
very.
good for anybody listening with no video. Mike has generated a mental value flywheel effect, which doesn't make any sense. He's got five things in it instead of four. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah. There we go.
It's anyway, enough of that. So we're continuing our series through the book. So we're on chapter 10, which is part of the I think start up the second phase of the flywheel, which is a challenge the environment for success. This is an interesting one, a socio-technical system for change. It's a short chapter, but it's a huge topic. Well, first of all, do you think I remember we had a big debate, should we include this or not? Do you think we were right to include this?
I think so. I
Technical
think it,
stuff?
I think it's we always wanted to tread very carefully on this topic because there's so much actual real data and science and experts behind it. So we wanted to tread very carefully in this, but I think you can't just apply technology without thinking about how the socio-technical impacts of it work, right? So something we're always very mindful of. You can't do these things in isolation. So you got to think about the people. You got to think about how change is actually implemented. So I think it's critical to surface this stuff and get people to explore it. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, yeah, I mean, most of the hardest things you've got to deal with for speed and with an organization are socio, aren't they? And how to optimize for those things. And a lot of what we've kind of had to do in the past is kind of unblock certain things, yeah, right? Or optimize certain things, and again, it definitely feeds into that whole concept of flow. How you set up your organizations, how do you set up your organization to be as efficient as possible? And again, even topics like reducing handoffs, or how do you spread expertise? How do you shape your organization for delivery? And I think it's even mentioned there in that chapter. It really focuses on time to value, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's an important one to cover. But then obviously there's books like Team Topologies and things which kind of go into the socio-technical stuff in a lot more detail, right? And that's a good read. But yeah, 100%. It's an important part.
And I think it's really important.
You can have the best technology in the world, but if you don't have the people to champion it and expose it to people and take people on the journey, then it's never going to be used properly. So it's important that stuff works in concert.
And it's a system for change as well. I think it's interesting. I mean, often in a company, we find people like, well, I do people stuff and I do tech stuff. And they don't really talk, and that's a huge problem. I remember when I was a tech lead earlier on, reading about things like emotional intelligence and trying to understand what these things are. And people are like, you shouldn't be reading that. You should be doing the tech stuff. And you're like, well, it's kind of related, but not really known. So it's been interesting there to explore. It also should be said like that we were super nervous writing this because there's lots of really smart academics that have been studying this for decades. So in no way trying to replace any of that stuff. I certainly wouldn't call myself an expert, but I just think it's really interesting to explore it and just read about it as opposed to be an expert on it. We did I suppose the thing that we had used is that idea of there's four parts of it. There's the social, which is the people and the teams.
Yeah.
The technical, which is the actual, all the code and service, etc. That problem prevention mindset, which was just trying to prevent problems as opposed to fix them, and then time to value, which is just flow. So, and there's almost like for me, there's always a mental model how those four things fit together, and it's not an accident that the people comes first.
Yeah.
You need to figure out your teams, make sure the right technology, the right skills, and then the flow. You can't do that out of order, really.
Yeah, and it's back to even the start of the book and talking about clarity of purpose, right? Who are your actual users? What do they need from the thing you're trying to do? And is the technology you're bringing to bear on this actually going to help meet those needs? It's like some basic stuff in here, but it's amazing how often it's overlooked. Mm-hmm. No, 100%. I mean, even we were talking about it today a wee bit, Dave.
Mm.
We're I remember way back in the day, there was a security where, like security was maybe centralized. And then we were like, how do you decentralize security just from a,
Mm.
prevention perspective and just make it more of a general thing, that
Mm.
you as an engineer, we can take on security, we can show what we're thinking about, and then we can run that past the expert, but we don't have the expert as a blocking factor in terms of how we approach something. We've taken on the problem prevention. We've kind of socialized almost the security element or the secure dev practices, and we've come up with a process that just allows teams to kind of move and keep moving, and own it effectively. But it also respects the expertise, right? So
Mm.
there'll be times where you do have to kind of engage the expert and
Mm.
kind of move fast. So I think when you're talking about your flywheel, I think it's a critical ingredient to it, right?
Mm.
So you do have to embrace expertise, but at the same time, you can't get bogged down with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the democratization of stuff. Like I know
Democratize.
even talking about it's similar to the AI stuff. If you have a centralized AI team that do all the AI stuff,
Yeah,
as the technology, they might have the technical chops and the flow, but if you don't bring the people along with you, forget about it.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
It's like that enablement work that they'll know a lot of platform engineering and DevX teams. They'll do a lot of enablement work and sometimes goes unrecognized. But that's
Mm.
that's that's what greases your flywheel. It's those having those conversations and exposing people to some of these capabilities or patterns, like you mentioned, Mike, around the threat modeling and being secure by design and all those practices. It doesn't
mm-hmm.
happen by magic. You have to do the hard yard. You have to go and talk to the people and walk them through the workshops and you know show the experts that teams aren't going to mess this up. So
Yeah,
you got to do that for all of these initiatives, and AI is just another phase, another wave of that. New technologies coming in that we need to make sure that we work with all areas of an org to really understand it, to really leverage it, to really make sure it's actually fit for purpose and actually meets their needs.
yeah. I think this is one as architects. Sometimes architecture slows us down, but really what you're thinking about there are enabling. You use it all the time, Mark. I think like enabling constraints but there's just certain things there you want teams to consider as they go, and again, it's looking after the organization and also looking after the teams without stifling creativity and also respecting the need to move fast. So
Mm.
it's
I
a
think
really complex topic for sure.
we do mention it in the technical sort of bucket there around the Wardley map, and the Wardley map is always really good for us to identify where the problems may be as we start to roll out some of these changes. So
Yeah,
that then leads into the problem prevention. It's like, oh, we better go talk to that person. We better go talk to that department. Otherwise, we're going to be blocked in 3 months' time. So let's give them a heads up that, hey, we're going to be doing this new initiative or this new thing. Are you comfortable with this? It's like making the map visible and then identifying where are those inertia points really helps identify, okay, let's get ahead of this. Let's prevent that problem from happening, down the line, right?
mm-hmm.
Mm. I think there's two for me. There's two interesting lenses you put in this. The first one is we'll say the technology only, and one of the nice things that it's in there the intersection of people and technology about taking that outside in approach and that start where your user need, making technology choices to work for the people, good technical leadership, all that stuff about really thinking about how you set teams up for success. That's the kind of first thing. And then the second thing is that really, I don't know what you call it, that traditional management. If we give them better tools, they'll type the code in faster.
Yeah.
I mean, that just never ever works. I think there was, and I don't know if this is true or not, but there was supposedly a very old example of this for coal mines, where people will think, well, if you just give people better equipment, they'll mine faster, and
Mm-hmm.
that was proven time and time again to fail. You know what I mean? Because if people are getting injured by using tools incorrectly or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's just not going to work. So it's
Yeah.
the old thing, like if you give people better tools, they'll go faster. It just couldn't further from the truth.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. Like even in recent kind of engagements we've had, it's been more around, how do we again from the given the socio this setup within the organization, what is the best way to maneuver effectively? you know, and then we may have kind of spun up, you know, like sort of platform teams or, you know, feature teams or complex subsystem teams, depending on what was required. You know, like say you needed to cover like a lot of front end kind of work across maybe 10, you know, 10 squads. You may kind of set up something reasonably kind of centralized to kind of move fast, and kind of spread those practices across the squads and kind of, you know, maneuver across the socio side of things, you know, and accelerate certain things. So again, it'll differ, right, depending on the circumstance you're dealing with. And again, it's a wee bit of critical thinking involved there as well, right?
Yeah.
You never have two things tend to, you know, you'll always have the adapt and, you know.
Is there like situational awareness and critical thinking, and also
Yeah.
I don't know how to frame this, but just having a bit of common sense sometimes. It's like just don't go in with both feet immediately saying, "Hey, we're going to transform the whole org." It's like, no, you're only just in 5 minutes. Give it a couple of months, right?
Yeah.
There's an organizational thing here as well, which is super interesting. And I mean, that's captured as well in the chapter about the guy called Fred Emery, who was a Australian psychologist. In the 60s, he wrote about this thing as purpose versus function. And he talked about design principle 1, where you just train people to be very good at the skills and the managers will figure out the work. Design principle 2 was that people really organize, you know, in teams with a sense of purpose. And then there's laissez-faire, people just go nuts. So there's a lot of like, I mean, that thinking is, God, what, 65 years old, like, and we're still not doing it properly, you know. So it's like this stuff is not new at all. But then you even the likes of Simon Sinek talking about, you know, start with why and stuff. I mean, he's still talking about that purpose stuff. I just find it fascinating how people have been saying that for decades, and it's not really being heard by a lot of organizations. I think it's getting better, but it's still not great.
Yeah. I mean, even I don't know, like I like to kind of apply like evolutionary architectural approaches to certain things, you know, and I'd always say start with the hardest problems first, right? And again, and how do you organize around those hardest problems? And again, sometimes that is doing something quite novel, or, you know, just, you know, setting yourself up to kind of deal with those challenges up front accordingly, right? In a nice, thoughtful kind of way.
Yeah.
So yeah,
probably the first thing that really hit me years ago, could have been maybe 10 years ago, was the Daniel Pink stuff, Drive.
That's right.
Is the autonomy, mastery, and sense of purpose, that intrinsic motivation, I suppose, of not a fear of punishment or the promise of reward. That was massively impactful for me reading that book years ago. Another example of that same principle.
It makes change a lot easier. Everyone has clarity of purpose, and everyone's behind the mission and understands why they're doing what they're doing. That makes change so much easier. It's a lot harder to change an org if everyone's all over the place.
Yeah, I always thought that stuff super interesting. And then as well, we touch on the Cynefin stuff. Remember going what? It's the framework by Dave Snowden, spelled Cynefin. It's a Welsh word. I think it took me about 2 years to pronounce it properly. It's called Cynefin, which is not correct. So and that was always very interesting about you know, what domain or context the components in, being it was like, you know, clear, complicated, and complex, chaotic, and confused. And the thing there was always, you know, explaining the difference between complicated and complex. Where complex is like, you know how to do it, but it's difficult. And complex is like, you know, we need to just probe. We don't really know what's happening here. They're not very good examples, but
test and learn. Right? Just
yeah,
try and experiment with a particular department, see how they respond, and then if they respond well, then okay, you can keep going. And if they respond badly, then you can change tack to something else.
Yeah,
critical thinking there. Like, I mean, do you remember we used that years ago about, you know, different teams were in different states?
Yep.
You could see, like, you know, these guys are clear, they're just tapping along, it's dead easy. They should be really hitting it out of the park around good practices. This stuff's complicated. These guys are chaotic, and these guys are confused. They don't know where they are. You know, there's all sorts of kind of moves. That was a really interesting framework.
Yeah, was indeed.
I mean, it is interesting in organizations. You know, it's because even with Cynefin and things like that, and even when Wardley talks about using mixed methods, it's really just it's adapting to the situation you're in. Like Cynefin's you think about it, like it's a model, how you model complexity, and then given sort of what complexity you're dealing with, you're going to organize in a certain way, and your goal is to go from complexity to complicated and complicated to known. And you don't really want to be, or even it's okay to be in chaotic, but you're acknowledging you're in chaotic, so you may optimize your teams or your approach for dealing with chaotic. And it's just being conscious enough and being aware enough to then take an approach to say, okay, while we're in this phase, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have teams that are comfortable with this. We're going to operate in a certain way, and we're going to deal with it until we get to another point, and then we'll reevaluate, right?
I think it's back to the socio bit there. You want to make sure that the people in those teams are comfortable in chaotic situations, and they're not going to get too stressed out by lots of unknowns, where certain people just want to be very clear about what their mission is, what they're trying to achieve, right?
Yeah, you find a lot of organizations, particularly enterprise organizations, everything's really process oriented, everything's very known. And then if you go from a known kind of state into a complex state where you've got to have teams who are comfortable in the gray and be, not have the answers up front, but be comfortable and then get out with maybe an experimental approach to delivery. That's a very different ask, and you will get friction, you will get pushback. And, so as a leader, you've got to really account for those shifts.
Yeah, that's back to what Simon would always say around use appropriate methods, right?
Yeah. Depending on what situation you're in, so if you're in a complex space and you're trying to find an answer to something, you may go more experimental. You may try stuff until it works, or if you're, if you're in a known state, you may go with more kind of project management. You may be able to scale up, go contracts, go contractor type squads, depending on what you're dealing with. So it's just helping teams think through how to adapt the situation.
There's always an interesting one where we talk to teams and it's very clear to us what they should be doing, but to them they feel like it's all chaotic.
Yeah.
That's usually a nice little challenge where you're going, you just need to follow these steps and you'll be fine. When I don't even know the steps.
Yeah.
There's so many things around it. Like, you can leave listing, but there's loads. And that idea of feedback loops is really important. Mm-hmm. And there's a wee tiny bit in here about complex adaptive systems. And I think once you start thinking about that type of stuff, I remember being at a conference, I think it was in Scotland years ago, where Diana Larson did a talk about complex adaptive systems and how, when I know the flock of starlings, the memorization, how that works. Blown my mind. How do you think about teams and what people do and how systems work and these systems thinking? Like, I remember thinking it's like agile on steroids, but there is a shape to it, but it's extremely difficult kind of math and science. I'll not claim to understand it, but it's super interesting. It probably goes beyond writing software, but it's really interesting to think of how a large organization works.
Yeah.
He does some great stuff. Still does. I think the feedback loops are still really important.
Yep.
I think there's definitely something there about, it's a great question for a team. What's your feedback loop, or what should that be?
Yep.
It kind of cuts right to the quick.
Yeah, I think even reflecting on this after 3 or 4 years now, it's still stands up. Still very applicable to today's world, and I think with the new wave of putting AI on everything, this stuff becomes more and more important. Is what are the impacts on the socio-technical aspects rather than just, hey, we're going to sprinkle AI on everything.
Yeah, I definitely argue the socio-technical stuff is maybe one of the harder aspects of changing organizations, because you're changing mindsets, you're changing kind of tradition and routine, and most organizations have like set, it's very predictable kind of routines and very predictable, everything's aimed for predictability, and really a lot of what we're saying with some of particularly more the agile stuff, more, those sorts of things it's not that. Right, so it's a huge upheaval, and it's there's a lot of trust involved in it too. But in order to make that right, David, it's always the feedback cycles. How are they measuring success? Are they are they inspecting? Are they responding? And are they making good decisions? Are they learning? Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. it's no mistake that like within the flywheel itself, the first two phases, that clarity of purpose and challenge, are very much people focused. Where the second two, the next best action, long-term value, are very much technical focused. We've spent a lot of our time in the technical. I think we probably do them pretty well. It's a real interesting challenge, trying to do the clarity of purpose and get the environment right. That's the real hard part. And often people will say, just you put a good architecture in and we'll be grand. And you're like, no, that's not going to work. It's like your teams are part of your system. People often go, what? Yeah. So that's always it's a big topic. So that's a crack. I thought that was an interesting chapter. Like I said, I'm certainly no expert in this. I think I've just been enjoying reading about this and confusing myself. So it was nice to put in a chapter there to just acknowledge it. And there's a few people talking about socio-technical systems, especially in the DDD community, who are brilliant. Those are really interesting talks. I would always, if a talk is socio-technical in the title, just strap in. It'll be good. So that's the crack. Give us a listen now on give us a like on the Serverless Age, and check out the website or blog, and see you next time.
Thanks everyone.
Bye, Rudy.